Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be replacing brake lines on a 2011 Toyota Camry using LinesToGo part number BLT-137-SS. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2011 Toyota Camry, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown on your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made using 304L stainless steel for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Make sure to depressurize the fuel system before starting the installation. Tools required: 5mm hex bit, 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, 16mm, and 21mm sockets and ratchet, 10mm, 12mm, 13mm, and 14mm wrenches, flat blade and Phillips screwdrivers, pick, cutting pliers, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be medium. To depressurize the fuel system, locate the fuel pump fuse using your owner's manual and remove it. Start the vehicle and wait for the engine to stall. Make sure to replace the fuse once completed. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. Remove the electrical connector at the mass airflow sensor. Remove the vacuum tubes from the air filter housing. Remove the larger tube from the intake tube. Open the 3 locking clips on the air filter housing. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the clamp that secures the intake air tube to the throttle body. Lift up on the air filter housing lid and remove the housing lid and intake air tube from the vehicle. Remove the intake air filter. Use a Phillips blade screwdriver to remove the vacuum switching valve from the lower half of the air filter housing and remove the last remaining vacuum tube. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 3 bolts that secure the lower half of the air filter housing and remove the housing from the vehicle. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 4 bolts that secure the throttle body to the intake. Position the throttle body off to the side. Remove the electrical connector on the passenger side of the intake. Remove the 2 PCV tubes from the intake. Use a 10mm socket and a 5mm hex bit to remove the bolts that secure the plastic intake manifold. Use a 12mm wrench to remove the bolt at the rear of the intake manifold. Remove the vacuum tube from the brake booster. Remove the plastic intake from the vehicle. Cover the lower intake ports using a rag or by covering with masking tape. It is very important that nothing falls into these ports during the removal and installation process. Use a 12mm and a 14mm socket to remove the bolts that secure the top engine torque mount and remove it from the vehicle. Use a 10mm and a 12mm wrench to remove the 6 threaded fittings in the ABS module. Raise and support the vehicle and remove all 4 wheels using a 21mm socket. At the rear of the vehicle, above the rear of the fuel tank, use a 16mm socket to remove the 2 nuts on either side that secure the sway bar bushing mounts. Pull the mounts down away from the subframe. Use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings at the rear flex hoses. If the fittings are seized to the lines, you can cut the line and remove the fitting using a socket or wrench. Remove the bracket at the bottom of the lines. Remove the right rear brake line from the plastic clips above the rear subframe. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the right rear brake line near the fuel filler tube. Remove the rearmost section of the right rear brake line from the vehicle. Remove the lines from the plastic clips underneath the vehicle. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut both rear brake lines underneath the vehicle near the center. Remove the brake and fuel lines from the plastic clip at the front of the fuel tank. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the left rear park brake cable. At the front of the fuel tank, disconnect the supply line quick connect fitting. Remove the 2 rear sections of the rear brake lines from the vehicle. On the passenger side of the firewall, near the bottom, use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 threaded fittings on the driver's side of the factory union. We found it easiest to reach up beside the exhaust from underneath the vehicle to reach these fittings. Remove the brake lines from the plastic clip behind the front subframe. Remove the forward section of the rear brake lines from underneath the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 remaining fittings from the factory union on the passenger side of the firewall. Remove the brake lines from the plastic clips along the firewall. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the top of the right front flex hose. Use a flat blade screwdriver or pick to depress the locking tab on the power steering reservoir mount and lift up on the reservoir to position it off to the side. Remove the right front brake line from the vehicle. Remove the plastic bracket that supports the air conditioning lines. Remove the 2 forwardmost sections of the rear brake lines from the vehicle. Remove the remaining lines from the plastic clip on the passenger side of the engine. Use a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the bolt that secures the rear bracket and remove the bracket from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the passenger side of the bottom factory union on the driver's side of the vehicle. Use a 12mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting on the passenger side of the top factory union on the driver's side of the vehicle and the fitting at the front of the master cylinder. Pull the 3 remaining brake lines at the ABS module forward and cut them using a pair of cutting pliers as far back as you can and remove the sections nearest to the ABS module from the vehicle. Please note that this set of lines has been redesigned to eliminate the need to disconnect the air conditioning lines at the firewall. Remove the 3 remaining sections of the lines that were cut from the vehicle. Use a 12mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the rear port in the master cylinder and the top factory union and remove the line from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the bottom factory union on the driver's side of the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the top of the left front flex hose. Remove the final section of the left front brake line from the vehicle. To begin the installation of your new stainless steel LinesToGo brake lines, start by installing the forwardmost section of the right rear brake line labeled 06A into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the passenger side central port in the ABS module by hand. Start the bottom fitting into the passenger side of the bottom factory union on the firewall. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the forwardmost section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05A into position. Start the top fitting into the driver's side central port in the ABS module by hand. Start the bottom fitting into the passenger side of the top factory union on the firewall. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04 into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the passenger side port in the ABS module by hand. Start the bottom fitting into the top of the right front flex hose. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Replace the plastic bracket that secures the air conditioning lines. Next, install the first section of the LinesToGo primary brake line labeled 01A into position. Start the top fitting into the rear port in the master cylinder and the bottom fitting into the driver's side of the top factory union. Tighten both fittings using a 13mm wrench. Install the next section of the LinesToGo primary brake line labeled 01B into position and start one fitting into the passenger side of the top factory union. Next, install the final section of the primary brake line labeled 01C into position. Start one fitting into the driver's side horizontal port in the ABS module by hand. Connect the two sections of line using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connections. Tighten the fittings in the factory union and the ABS module using a 13mm wrench and the LinesToGo union using two 14mm wrenches. Next, install the secondary LinesToGo brake line labeled 02A into position. Start one fitting into the front port in the master cylinder by hand. Next, install the final section of the secondary LinesToGo brake line labeled 02B into position. Start one fitting into the passenger side horizontal port in the ABS module by hand. Connect the two sections of line using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the LinesToGo union using two 14mm wrenches. Tighten the fittings in the master cylinder and ABS module using a 13mm wrench. Next, install the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03C into position. Start the top fitting into the driver's side of the bottom factory union. Start the other fitting into the top of the left front flex hose. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Install the next section of the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03B into position. Start one fitting into the passenger side port in the bottom factory union. Next, install the final section of the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03A into position. Start one fitting into the top driver's side port in the ABS module by hand. Connect the two sections using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the LinesToGo union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the fittings in the ABS module and factory union using a 10mm wrench. Underneath the vehicle, install the next section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06B into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the driver's side of the lower factory union located on the passenger side of the firewall. Install the next section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06C into position. Connect the two sections of line together using the supplied union noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Install the final section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06D into position, routing it over the rear subframe. Start one fitting into the top of the right rear flex hose. Connect the sections using the supplied union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Secure the line into the plastic clips. Tighten the fittings in the front factory union and the rear flex hose using a 10mm wrench and the LinesToGo unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Next, install the left rear brake line labeled 05B into position. Start the front fitting into the driver's side of the top factory union. Next, install the final section of the left rear brake line labeled 05C into position. Start the rear fitting into the top of the left rear flex hose. Connect the sections of line using the supplied union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the fittings in the front factory union and the left rear flex hose using a 10mm wrench. Tighten the LinesToGo union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Use a 16mm socket to replace the nuts that secure the sway bar brackets at the rear. Replace the brake and fuel lines into the plastic clip at the front of the fuel tank. Replace the fuel supply line quick connect fitting at the front of the fuel tank. Secure the left rear park brake cable using a 10mm socket. Bleed all four wheels using an 8mm wrench, making sure to keep the master cylinder reservoir topped up with fluid. Replace the power steering reservoir back into position. Install the engine torque mount and tighten the bolts using a 12mm and a 14mm socket. Remove the cover that was placed over the engine intake ports and make sure the top surface is clean so the intake manifold gasket can seal properly. Make sure the intake gaskets are in the proper location and install the intake manifold back into position. Use a 5mm hex bit and a 10mm socket to tighten the intake manifold mounting bolts, starting from the center of the manifold working outward. Use a 12mm wrench to replace the bolt at the rear of the intake manifold. Replace the vacuum tube at the brake booster. Reconnect the PCV tubes to the intake manifold. Replace the throttle body and secure it using a 10mm socket. Connect the larger vacuum tube at the intake manifold. Reconnect the electrical connector on the passenger side of the intake manifold. Replace the lower half of the intake air filter housing and secure it using a 10mm socket. Replace the intake air filter along with the air filter housing lid and intake tube. Connect the other PCV tube to the intake air tube. Use a 10mm socket to tighten the band clamp that secures the intake air tube to the throttle body. Reconnect the mass airflow electrical connector. Replace the vacuum switching valve using a Phillips blade screwdriver. Reconnect the 4 small vacuum tubes. Replace all 4 wheels and torque to your manufacturer's recommended torque specification using a 21mm socket. Reconnect the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. This concludes the installation of stainless steel brake lines on a 2011 Toyota Camry using LinesToGo part number BLT-137-SS. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992. Email us at info@linestogo.com or check out our website link below. Don't forget to take advantage of our free next day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you in our next video.